Israel's prime minister says the top Hamas leader, Yahya Sinwar, has been killed in a military operation in Gaza. Sinwar was considered the chief architect behind the Hamas October 7th terror attack on Israel that left more than 1,000 people dead. Now, that attack also triggered the war in Gaza, which health officials there say has killed more than 42,000 people.
The Israeli military released this drone footage that they say shows Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar shortly before he was killed. Covered in dust and injured during an operation by the Israeli army, he throws an object at the drone. The IDF said Sinwar was trying to flee from house to house in Rafah when they targeted him.
For the past year, Sinwar tried to escape justice. He failed. We said we would find him and bring him to justice, and we did it.
Sinwar's body was brought to the Center for Forensic Medicine in Tel Aviv, where his identity was confirmed. News of his death was welcome outside. Sinwar's killing is seen as a significant victory for Israel as the war against Hamas drags on into its second year.
While this is not the end of the war in Gaza, it's the beginning of the end. To the people of Gaza, I have a simple message. This war can end tomorrow. It can end if Hamas lays down its arms and returns our hostages.
Israelis took to the streets in several cities to celebrate Sinwar's death. But for the families of the Israeli hostages and their supporters, the news brings uncertainty about what will happen next.
Look, I think that all the terrorists eventually have a replacement. There's never a vacuum. There will always come someone instead.
Nobody is really know what it's going to be tomorrow, in the next few hours, in the next week, because this was a really game-changing.
Many Israelis are now calling on the government to use Sinwar's death as an opportunity to bring an end to the conflict and bring their loved ones home.
I'm joined now by Barbara Slavin. She's reported from the Middle East and is the author of a book on the U.S.-Iranian conflict. She's a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center in Washington. Barbara, welcome. Does Yahya Sinwar's death mark a turning point in this conflict?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. That's something we don't know yet. It could, but that depends on a couple of variables. It depends on those who are still holding hostages in Gaza, being ready and willing to release them. It depends on whether the Israeli government, and I mean here Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu in particular, are ready for a ceasefire. His initial comments did not suggest that he is ready for a ceasefire. I think that the Israelis are going to continue their offensives in Gaza and against Hezbollah in Lebanon for at least the next couple of weeks until we see the results of the American elections. But this is good news, assuming that there are people in Gaza who are in a position and of a frame of mind that they're willing to make decisions about releasing the hostages. I think that could unlock a ceasefire and potentially begin to end this horrible war.
I want to come back to that in just a moment, but first I want to ask about Sinwar himself. We know that he was a very central figure in Hamas. He was the chief architect of the October 7th attacks. Was his death more of a shock or more destabilizing for this organization potentially than Haniya's death, the political leader's death in July?
Again, I've been around a while. I've seen that Israel has been able to assassinate many leaders of adversarial organizations, and invariably these people are replaced. It's not a surprise, I'm sure, that Sinwar died. He was out there fighting with ordinary soldiers, clearly taking risks, not hiding in a tunnel. And he should have known and must have known that he could have been killed at any time. So I'm sure that Hamas will replace him. The problem, I think, is that the way the war has been conducted with this extraordinarily high death toll, so much damage and devastation, has likely radicalized another generation of Palestinians. So even if there are many Gazans who are privately happy to see Sinwar die and blame him for what has happened to them, there are others who will be inspired by him. And until the Israelis recognize that they have to come up with some sort of long-term political solution to the issue of the Palestinians, I think we're going to continue to see violence and actions against Israelis. Maybe not on the scale of last October 7th, but there will be continuing violence.
Do we know if Sinwar has a successor?
We don't yet. There's a lot of speculation that it might be Khalid Mashal, who is one of the political leaders in Qatar. There are others who've been in Turkey, other places. I think Sinwar used to refer to them rather disparagingly as hotel leaders of Hamas because they live in hotels, not on the ground in Gaza. But there are individuals who can step in. And then, of course, there are younger people in Gaza, fighters whose names we probably don't yet know.
U.S. President Joe Biden has said that this moment is an opportunity to end the war in Gaza. You just mentioned the complications in the long term that this conflict is creating in terms of radicalizing a new generation. As for this conflict right now, is Israel likely to see it as Biden does, that this is, as Netanyahu himself has said, the beginning of the end, whatever that means?
Well, again, if the hostages are freed, if they can be freed, I think that would make a huge difference, and that could sway Israeli public opinion. After all, Israelis are exhausted by the past year of war. They want to be able to go back to their homes in the south and in the north. If there is a ceasefire in Gaza, I think that would persuade Hezbollah to stop fighting the Israelis. I don't know if it would persuade the Israelis to stop fighting Hezbollah. Remember, they're entrenched in Lebanon now again. But that could have a good impact. It would certainly influence groups like the Houthis, Iraqi militias. But we've left out another very important variable, and that is the confrontation between Israel and Iran. Israel has been threatening to respond in a rather massive way to Iran's missile barrage of October the 1st, which was in itself a response to previous Israeli assassinations of the leader of Hezbollah, of a Hamas political leader in Tehran, and so on. So how will that be resolved? Will Netanyahu now hold off on an Israeli response? If he doesn't, and I have no indication that he will not go forward with some sort of retaliation, then the cycle of escalation is likely to continue. President Biden has been talking about a ceasefire for a very long time, but he's been unwilling to put the sort of pressure on Israel that might help convince the Israelis, at least, to scale back. Instead, we've seen the war get broader and wider.
To what extent could this even embolden Netanyahu or improve his standing domestically as he looks at Iran, as he looks at Hezbollah?
Netanyahu doesn't appear to have any interest in the end to the war. As long as the war goes on, he is prime minister, and he is not going to have to face corruption charges. He's not going to have to go to jail. He's not going to have a reckoning with the Israeli people for the intelligence failures of a year ago that led to Hamas's assault on Israel. I don't see that he has any interest in stopping, at least not until U.S. elections. Perhaps if Kamala Harris wins, he might see it in his interest to begin to wind this down. But if it's Donald Trump, I think all bets are off.
Could this, however, in the coming months, set up, in fact, new expectations from the U.S., this being seen as a kind of watershed moment that could ultimately lead to more tensions with Netanyahu and Israel?
Again, I think it depends on what happens in our elections. I know that many American officials are unhappy with Netanyahu and feel that he has been as much of an obstacle to peace as Yahya Sinwar was. If Harris wins, that will give Biden an opportunity as lame duck president to do perhaps some controversial things that will not be necessarily a burden on Kamala Harris when she takes office, if she takes office next year. So that's a window of opportunity for a number of de-escalatory actions, not just regarding Gaza, but also Lebanon and also Iran. But we have to get through our elections first. And as I said, if Trump wins, I'm afraid that's just going to embolden Bibi Netanyahu even further.
All right, that's Barbara Slavin of the Stimson Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hazem Balousha is a journalist who formerly reported for DW News from Gaza, and he joins me now from the city of Hamilton in Ontario, Canada. Hazem, welcome. Do we have any idea what Sinwar's death could mean for Palestinians in Gaza?
It means a lot. It means for different Palestinians, like those, especially for those who were affiliated or support Hamas. This is a big loss. This is a big problem. Some of them, like today, they were not trying to accept or deny the death of Sinwar. For those people who, like they were in favor of October 7, they were trying, to like, some of them, they would celebrate it publicly. Some of them now in Gaza, they said that, this death should lead to an end of the war.
We saw just a moment ago how central a figure he was for Hamas in recent years. How damaging now is his death for the organization itself?
Well, Sinwar was the top leader of Hamas. He was appointed as a top leader or the political bureau chief for Hamas after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran a few months ago, and he's the architect of October 7. He's the most powerful person in the movement, in the government, in the organization. So his loss is a big thing for Hamas. That's why, or that explains a bit that why Hamas is not admitting or saying anything about this.
We saw there that the Israeli military called him, right after the October 7th attacks, a dead man walking. Now they've gotten him. Surely he knew or suspected this day was coming. Is there a successor in the wings?
Well, it's not easy to predict. When Haniyeh was assassinated before, a lot of rumors. The list was like in the top. The list was Sinwar, but surprisingly, Hamas appointed him as the top leader. Now we are talking about few names. Some of them they already been in the position, like Khalid Mashal, who was the top leader for almost two decades. Khalil al-Hayya, who's the deputy of Sinwar, he's the deputy of Hamas political bureau in Gaza Strip. There is another one who's currently is managing the movement called Mohammed Darwish, who's the head of the Shura Council. Another one could be is the Zahir Jabbareen, who's the top leader of the Hamas movement branch in the West Bank, who's based actually in Turkey or between Turkey and Doha.
Hazem, very briefly, with Sinwar's death, can we say that a burden or an obstacle to a ceasefire has now effectively been removed? Is it more likely that Hamas will agree to a ceasefire?
It's still not easy. We don't know what Hamas' reaction would be. Actually, Hamas today kept silent, so we can't know if that would remove an obstacle. Hamas always claimed that Israel is the obstacle. Netanyahu, as an Israeli prime minister, is the main obstacle. So I don't know if that would make a change, but in the coming few days, I think it will be more clearer.
All right, Hazem Balousha, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's go to our correspondent, Tania Krämer in Jerusalem. Tania, what made Sinwar the top target for Israel?
Well, I mean, he was the number one on Israel's hit list now for quite some time. He was considered to be the mastermind of the October 7 terror attacks in southern Israel. And basically, his killing was one of the key objectives given by the government in this war. It took a year-long manhunt to get to Yahya Sinwar, and now the killing of this Hamas leader is certainly seen as a major achievement here in Israel.
Can we say if his death will change the direction of this conflict?
Well, this is one of the main questions that's certainly also being asked in Israel, but also by many Palestinians, especially in Gaza. Now, we've seen over the course of this war many such moments where they thought, believed to be game changers. Also, of course, the assassinations of other top leaders like Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran or Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut. But then we've also seen that it didn't have that much impact on Israel's military actions or on the course of this war in general. So Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said tonight, this is not yet the end, but it's the beginning of the end. We're seeing, of course, also the war continuing in Gaza, especially in northern Gaza. We've seen just a renewed ground operation in northern Gaza and a deteriorating humanitarian situation. But what's of main concern here in Israel for many people is what does that mean for the hostages that are still being held in Gaza. About 100 hostages are still being there, and there's a lot of pressure now by the families and relatives of those hostages on the government to use this momentum, as they said, and to put some more pressure to get a ceasefire deal done that would also see the release. We heard a similar words also by the Biden administration, but there's also already some pushback within the Israeli cabinet to instead use more military pressure. So all of this is still to see what it means, and certainly will also depend on the next moves by Hamas.
And Tania, what about Hamas itself? Have we heard anything more from the group about the death of its leader?
Yeah, there was no official statement as of yet. Certainly, it's seen as another blow to Hamas. They've lost two leaders. As you said, Yahya Sinwar had replaced Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated in July. That's not just so long ago. But however, in the past, we've seen the movement having replaced their leaders rather quickly, very pragmatically. But it's also been said that they have taken a blow. Also, they are weakened. But again, now the question turns to who will actually replace Yahya Sinwar. This was also given, an indication in which direction Hamas is going. But I think what's also important to say for many Palestinians in Gaza, of course, they're also asking this question tonight. What does it mean? They want to see, of course, an end to this devastating war that has brought so much devastation, displacement and death to many civilians in Gaza.
That's DW correspondent Tania Krämer in Jerusalem. U.S. President Joe Biden has arrived in Berlin ahead of talks with the leaders of Germany, France, and the UK. They're due to discuss the war in Ukraine, but Sinwar's death and the future of Israel's war against Hamas will also be on the agenda. While aboard Air Force One, Biden spoke by phone with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and congratulated him on killing Sinwar. Speaking to reporters, Biden said he told Netanyahu, quote, "Now's the time to move on, move toward a ceasefire in Gaza, to make sure that we move in a direction that we're able to make things better for the whole world." He said it's time for this war to end and bring these hostages home. EU leaders meeting in Brussels have also reacted to Sinwar's killing. DW's Jack Perrick has more.
There have been some reactions here at the European Council summit of EU leaders here in Brussels to the news that Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, has been killed. We heard from the French President Emmanuel Macron. He called it a turning point and said that the opportunity must be seized to, firstly, for the hostages of the October the 7th terror attack to be released, but also for an end to the war to be brought about. Now, the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, after the summit, he was pressed in his press conference on whether he thought it would be easier or more difficult after the killing of Sinwar to bring about peace, and he said simply that is too difficult to say, but also said, sort of repeated his call that the people most responsible for the October the 7th terror attack, that they need to be brought to justice. Yahya Sinwar is broadly known to be the architect of that terror attack. Now, the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, she said that the killing of Sinwar will significantly weaken Hamas. All of this, though, is in the context of what we know about the discussions between all 27 EU leaders here in the room. It's a private room where they get together and have dinner. And I have some sources, some officials that have spoken to me that know what's going on in the room and explain to us what's happening. And they said that the sort of attitude here at this summit had changed towards Israel, that many more of the leaders started to question exactly what Israel is doing with its military operation in Gaza and indeed now in Lebanon. And one of them was quoted as saying that we have to decide when is enough enough. And that's really the context of what's going on here. It does seem that there is some shift in the way that EU leaders are starting to talk about the situation in the Middle East.